The year was 1305, and London's streets echoed with the cries of vendors hawking their wares and the clatter of horse hooves on cobblestone. But on this August morning, a different sound would soon fill the air, the roar of a bloodthirsty crowd gathering to witness what would become one of history's most notorious executions. The man they came to see die was William Wallace, the Scottish knight who had dared to defy the English crown and unite his countrymen against foreign rule. What transpired that day was not merely an execution, but a carefully orchestrated theater of cruelty designed to destroy both a man and the symbol he represented. The popular imagination, shaped by Hollywood films and romantic tales, has sanitized Wallace's final moments into something almost noble, a quick death for a brave hero. But the reality was far more sinister and infinitely more brutal. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, had crafted Wallace's punishment not just as retribution, but as a message that would echo through generations. This was to be a death so horrific, so public, and so thoroughly documented that it would serve as a warning to anyone who dared challenge English authority. The method chosen was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment reserved for traitors that represented the absolute pinnacle of judicial cruelty in medieval England. This wasn't simply about ending a life. It was about the systematic destruction of human dignity, the obliteration of hope, and the creation of a spectacle so terrifying that it would haunt the collective memory of Scotland for centuries to come. Today, we strip away the myth and examine the unflinching reality of William Wallace's final hours. To understand the full horror of Wallace's execution, we must first grasp the world that created it. Medieval Scotland, in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, was a land caught between independence and subjugation, where the concept of nationhood was still forming and loyalty was often determined by survival rather than sentiment. The Scottish Wars of Independence had erupted following a succession crisis, and Edward I saw an opportunity to bring Scotland under direct English control, viewing the Northern Kingdom as a rebellious province rather than a sovereign nation. William Wallace emerged from this chaos not as a nobleman seeking power, but as a minor landowner driven by personal loss and national outrage. His family had suffered under English occupation, and when he raised his sword at Stirling Bridge in 1297, he did so with the fury of a man who had lost everything and the vision of one who saw what Scotland could become. His victory there was more than tactical, it was symbolic, proving that English heavy cavalry could be defeated and that Scottish independence was not merely a dream. But Edward the Fine was not a king who tolerated defiance. Known for his ruthless suppression of Welsh resistance and his expulsion of Jews from England, Longshanks understood that rebellion was like fire. It could spread if not thoroughly extinguished. Wallace's success had to be not just reversed, but transformed into a cautionary tale. The English king needed to demonstrate that challenging his authority would result in consequences so severe that they would deter future generations from even contemplating resistance. The political context of 1305 was crucial to understanding Wallace's fate. By this time, most Scottish nobles had submitted to Edward's rule, seeing accommodation as preferable to annihilation. Wallace's continued resistance made him not just an enemy of England, but an embarrassment to the Scottish aristocracy who had chosen submission. His capture became a priority, not just for military reasons, but for political necessity. His very existence challenged the legitimacy of Scotland's surrender. The hunt for William Wallace lasted years, involving an extensive network of spies, informants, and collaborators. Edward I placed a substantial bounty on Wallace's head, and the English administration in Scotland worked systematically to isolate him from potential supporters. The net gradually tightened as former allies turned against him, driven by fear, greed, or simply the desire to survive in a world where association with Wallace had become synonymous with death. The betrayal came, as it often does in such stories, from within. In August 1305, Wallace was captured near Glasgow, likely through the treachery of Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had submitted to English rule. The exact circumstances remain debated by historians, but the outcome was clear. The man who had become the symbol of Scottish resistance was now in English hands. His capture was celebrated in London as a great victory, but for Edward the Fair, it was only the beginning of what he intended to be Wallace's ultimate humiliation. The journey from Scotland to London was itself a form of torture, designed to break Wallace's spirit before his final punishment. Bound and guarded, he was paraded through English towns, where crowds gathered to see the infamous Scottish rebel. This was psychological warfare at its most calculated, the transformation of a hero into a spectacle, a leader into a curiosity. By the time Wallace reached London, he had already endured weeks of degradation, but his ordeal was far from over. The trial of William Wallace was a legal farce, but it served an important propaganda purpose for the English crown. Held at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, the proceedings were conducted in Latin, a language Wallace likely did not understand. He was charged with treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, and various other crimes against the English crown. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. Wallace was being tried for treason against a king he had never acknowledged as his sovereign. When given the opportunity to speak, Wallace reportedly declared that he could not be guilty of treason against Edward I because he had never been Edward's subject. This defiant response sealed his fate, though in truth, the outcome had been predetermined. The trial was theater, designed to provide a legal veneer to what was essentially a predetermined execution. The judges, all appointed by Edward I, had no intention of showing mercy to the man who had become the symbol of Scottish resistance. The charges against Wallace were carefully crafted to justify the severity of his punishment. Treason was the most serious offense, punishable by the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering. The additional charges of murder and sacrilege, referring to his attacks on English soldiers and clergy, were designed to portray him as a criminal rather than a warrior. The English legal system had become a weapon of state terror, and Wallace was to be its most prominent victim. The sentence was pronounced with ceremonial gravity. Wallace was to be drawn through the streets of London, hanged by the neck, but not until dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and his body cut into 4 parts. Each element of this punishment carried symbolic meaning. The drawing represented his degradation, the hanging his rejection by heaven, the disemboweling his spiritual corruption, and the quartering his complete destruction. This was not merely execution, but annihilation. The morning of August 23, 1305, dawned clear and warm in London. The city had been preparing for this spectacle for days, with scaffolds erected and crowds gathering from across England to witness the death of the Scottish rebel. The authorities had turned Wallace's execution into a public holiday, complete with vendors selling food and drink to the assembled masses. This wasn't just about justice, it was entertainment, a reminder of the power of the English crown and the fate that awaited those who dared to challenge it. Wallace was first stripped and bound to a hurdle, a wooden frame that would drag him through the streets of London. The route had been carefully planned to maximize both the humiliation and the spectacle. From the Tower of London, where he had been held, the procession moved through the city's busiest districts, ensuring that as many people as possible would witness his degradation. The cobblestones tore at his flesh as he was dragged behind horses, leaving a trail of blood that marked his final journey. The crowds that lined the streets were a mixture of curiosity seekers, English patriots, and those who simply enjoyed witnessing the suffering of others. Medieval executions were public events, serving both as entertainment and as stark reminders of royal power. The spectators jeered and threw refuse at Wallace as he passed, their behavior encouraged by the authorities who wanted to ensure that his final moments were as humiliating as possible. This was state-sponsored cruelty on a massive scale. The procession moved slowly, allowing maximum time for the crowds to gather and for Wallace's suffering to be prolonged. Contemporary accounts describe him as conscious throughout this ordeal, his eyes fixed on some distant point as if seeing beyond the immediate horror of his situation. Whether this was defiance, resignation, or simple shock remains unknown. But witnesses noted that he never cried out or begged for mercy, a detail that would later become part of his legend. At Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground, a scaffold had been erected specifically for Wallace's death. The crowd here was even larger and more boisterous than along the route, with vendors selling pies and ale to spectators who had claimed the best viewing positions hours earlier. The carnival atmosphere was deliberate. The English authorities wanted Wallace's death to be remembered not as a martyrdom, but as a celebration of English justice and power. The executioner, a professional who had likely performed dozens of such killings, began his work with practiced efficiency. Wallace was first hanged by the neck, but the rope was positioned to ensure strangulation rather than a quick death by breaking the neck. The crowd watched as he struggled for breath, his face turning purple, his body convulsing in the universal dance of death by asphyxiation. But just as consciousness began to fade, he was cut down, still alive, still aware of what was happening to him. What followed was the most horrific part of the entire ordeal. While Wallace was still conscious, the executioner began the process of disemboweling him. Using a sharp knife, he cut open the abdomen and began removing the internal organs one by one. Contemporary accounts describe the victim's screams as unlike anything the witnesses had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of human suffering itself. The executioner held up each organ for the crowd to see before throwing it into a fire that had been prepared for this purpose. The symbolism of burning Wallace's entrails was not accidental. In medieval thought, the bowels were considered the seat of emotion and compassion. By burning them while he watched, the executioner was symbolically destroying Wallace's humanity, reducing him to something less than human in the eyes of the crowd. The smell of burning flesh and organs filled the air, adding another layer of horror to an already nightmarish scene. Through all of this, Wallace remained conscious, his eyes open and aware, even as his body was systematically destroyed. Some accounts suggest that he continued to speak, though what he said has been lost to history. The executioner's skill lay not just in causing maximum pain, but in keeping the victim alive as long as possible. Death would come as a release, not as the culmination of suffering. Finally, mercifully, the executioner moved to complete his grisly work. Wallace's head was severed with a single stroke of a sharp axe, ending his suffering at last. But even in death, the humiliation continued. The head was held up for the crowd to see, blood still dripping from the severed neck before being set aside for later display. The body was then cut into 4 quarters, each piece held up for the crowd's inspection like cuts of meat in a butcher's shop. The disposal of Wallace's remains was as calculated as his execution. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it and mounted on a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain for years as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging English authority. The 4 quarters of his body were sent to different Scottish cities, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth, where they were displayed publicly as reminders of the fate that awaited rebels. This distribution of Wallace's body parts was more than mere brutality. It was a form of political communication. Each piece served as a message to the local population, a physical reminder of English power and the consequences of resistance. The English understood that symbols could be as powerful as armies, and Wallace's dismembered body became a symbol of English dominance over Scotland. The immediate aftermath of Wallace's execution was exactly what Edward the Fun had hoped for. The brutal spectacle had served its purpose. Scottish resistance seemed to crumble in the face of such overwhelming demonstration of English power. Many who had supported Wallace either fled the country or submitted to English rule, calculating that no cause was worth such a horrific death. The execution had successfully transformed a symbol of resistance into a warning against rebellion. But Edward the Fern had miscalculated the Scottish response to Wallace's martyrdom. Rather than crushing Scottish resistance, the brutality of Wallace's execution actually strengthened it. The very horror of his death became a rallying cry for those who refused to accept English domination. Robert the Bruce, who would later become King of Scotland, was reportedly moved to action by the spectacle of Wallace's execution, seeing in it the true face of English rule. The manner of Wallace's death also influenced the tactics of future Scottish resistance. The lesson was clear. Capture by the English meant torture and humiliation beyond imagination. This knowledge led to a more desperate and determined form of warfare, where Scottish fighters preferred death in battle to surrender. Wallace's execution had created a culture of no quarter, where mercy was neither expected nor given. The political ramifications extended beyond Scotland's borders. Other European kingdoms watched the Wallace execution with interest and horror, seeing in it a demonstration of English methods that could easily be applied to them. The brutality of the execution became part of England's reputation, contributing to the isolation that would later complicate English foreign policy. Edward I's message of strength had been received, but so had the message of cruelty. The historical documentation of Wallace's execution is extensive, drawn from multiple contemporary sources that provide a remarkably detailed picture of the event. The Lanarkos Chronicle, written by English monks, describes the execution in clinical detail, noting the crowd's reaction and the duration of Wallace's suffering. These accounts, while biased toward the English perspective, provide valuable insight into medieval attitudes toward justice and punishment. Scottish sources, though fewer in number, offer a different perspective on the execution. The Chronicle of John of Fordun portrays Wallace as a martyr who faced death with dignity and courage, emphasizing his refusal to beg for mercy or renounce his cause. These accounts, while perhaps romanticized, reflect the impact of Wallace's death on Scottish national consciousness and the transformation of a military defeat into a moral victory. The legal records of Wallace's trial and execution provide perhaps the most objective account of the events. These documents, preserved in the English National Archives, reveal the careful planning that went into both the trial and the execution. Every detail was documented, from the charges against Wallace to the disposal of his remains, suggesting that the English authorities understood the historical significance of what they were doing. Witness accounts from both English and Scottish observers provide additional layers of detail about the execution. Some describe the crowd's bloodthirsty enthusiasm, while others note the apparent dignity with which Wallace faced his death. These varied perspectives highlight the complexity of the event and its different meanings for different audiences. The legacy of William Wallace's execution extends far beyond the immediate political consequences of his death. In the centuries that followed, his story became a foundational myth of Scottish nationalism, inspiring generations of Scots to resist foreign domination. The very brutality of his execution transformed him from a failed rebel into a symbol of martyrdom and resistance that proved more powerful in death than he had been in life. The execution also influenced the development of international law and concepts of human rights. Later legal scholars would point to Wallace's treatment as an example of judicial cruelty that violated fundamental principles of human dignity. The notion that even enemies of the state deserved basic human treatment began to emerge partly as a reaction to excesses like Wallace's execution. The cultural impact of Wallace's death can be seen in the literature, art, and music that emerged in subsequent centuries. From medieval ballads to modern films, his story has been told and retold, each generation finding new meaning in his sacrifice. The execution scene in particular has become a powerful symbol of the struggle between oppression and freedom, tyranny and justice. The psychological impact on the Scottish people was profound and lasting. Wallace's execution created a collective trauma that became part of Scottish cultural identity, a shared memory of suffering that united the nation in ways that military victory alone could not have achieved. The horror of his death became a source of strength, proving that some things were worth suffering for and that dignity could be maintained even in the face of ultimate degradation. The method of execution chosen for Wallace, hanging, drawing and quartering, was itself a statement about the nature of medieval justice and the relationship between ruler and subject. This particular form of execution was reserved for traitors, those who had violated the sacred bond between king and subject. By applying it to Wallace, Edward the Fine was asserting that all inhabitants of the British Isles were his subjects, whether they acknowledged it or not. The public nature of the execution was equally significant. Medieval justice was theatre, designed to reinforce social hierarchies and political relationships through spectacle. Wallace's execution was perhaps the most elaborate such performance of its era, involving not just the physical destruction of the victim, but the psychological conditioning of the audience. The crowd was not merely witnessing justice, but participating in a ritual of state power. The detailed documentation of the execution suggests that the English authorities understood they were creating a historical moment. The careful recording of every detail, from the route of the procession to the disposal of the body parts, indicates that this was intended to be remembered. The execution was not just about punishing Wallace, but about creating a narrative that would serve English interests for generations to come. The international dimension of the execution should not be overlooked. Medieval Europe was an interconnected world where news traveled quickly and reputation mattered enormously. Wallace's execution was witnessed by foreign dignitaries and reported across the continent, contributing to England's reputation as a power willing to use extreme measures to maintain control. This reputation would influence diplomatic relations for decades to come. As we reflect on the horror of William Wallace's execution, we confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the exercise of power. The crowds that gathered to watch his suffering were not monsters, but ordinary people who had been conditioned to accept and even enjoy the systematic destruction of another human being. Their enthusiasm for the spectacle reveals the capacity for cruelty that exists within civilized society when it is given official sanction. The execution also demonstrates how quickly the extraordinary can become routine. The executioner who dismembered Wallace was a professional, skilled in the art of prolonging suffering. The officials who organized the event were bureaucrats, following established procedures for dealing with traitors. The normalization of extreme cruelty is perhaps more disturbing than the cruelty itself, suggesting that civilization is always more fragile than we might believe. The transformation of Wallace from rebel to martyr illustrates the unpredictable nature of political symbolism. Edward the Fine intended the execution to demonstrate the futility of resistance, but instead it created a powerful symbol of the nobility of sacrifice for principle. The very excess of the execution contributed to its failure as a deterrent. The horror was so complete that it became sublime, transcending its immediate purpose to become something larger. The enduring fascination with Wallace's story speaks to our need for heroes who embody our highest ideals, even in, or perhaps especially in, the face of ultimate suffering. His execution reminds us that the greatest victories are sometimes moral rather than military, that dignity can be maintained even when everything else is stripped away, and that the human spirit can triumph even in the moment of the body's destruction. The story of William Wallace's execution is ultimately a story about the price of freedom and the cost of principle. In our comfortable modern world, it is easy to forget that the liberties we take for granted were purchased with the blood and suffering of those who came before us. Wallace's horrific death serves as a reminder that freedom is never free, and that those who enjoy it have a responsibility to honor the sacrifice of those who died for it. Today, as we face our own challenges to freedom and human dignity, Wallace's story remains relevant. The methods may have changed, but the fundamental struggle between oppression and liberty continues. His execution reminds us that there are principles worth suffering for, causes worth dying for, and that the choice between freedom and security is one that each generation must make for itself. The blood-soaked cobblestones of medieval London echo still with the message that some things are worth any price, and that the human spirit, even when broken, can still inspire others to carry on the fight.